Hello and welcome back to F1 Every Week. My name is Ben Wevel and today I'm going to be reviewing and analysing round 11 of the 2022 Formula 1 World Championship, the Austrian Grand Prix, the second sprint weekend of the season after Imola. Now I'm sorry this episode is coming out a day late. My computer has been acting up quite a lot yesterday, so I couldn't record it last night, but we're here now. The race was first on the calendar in 1964 at the only four-cornered Zeltweg airfield and returned again in 1970 to the Österreich Ring, which was renamed the A1 Ring on Austria's return to Formula 1 in 1997, and then again to the Red Bull Ring on Formula 1's return to Austria in 2014. Max Verstappen has been victorious 4 times in Austria, including last year's Styrian Grand Prix, with Alain Prost following behind with 3 victories. McLaren have taken 6 wins here, and Mercedes and Ferrari have taken 5 each as well. Austria has seen some very dramatic moments in recent years, with Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc locking horns in 2019, Lando Norris also taking his maiden podium here in Austria in the COVID-stricken 2020 season. You can listen to the podcast on a wide array of streaming platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts, all of which are linked below. And now, without further ado, let's get into episode 64. One of the big pieces of news coming into the race was the FIA's decision to increase the budget cap, set at the start of this season, by 3.1%. I've covered this issue at many points so far this season, which shows how controversial the issue of the budget cap has been so far. But the main gist is that because of the conflict in Ukraine, the constraints presented by the budget cap are, for some teams, far too difficult to comply with. Red Bull team principal Christian Horner has been an avid support of this throughout the season, and despite this, Christian still remains unsatisfied, describing the changes to the cap as not enough compared to the inflation. That man is never content, is he? Well, his spirits might have been somewhat raised on Friday afternoon as Max Verstappen achieved pole position for the sprint race, as well as taking the fastest time in FP1, the Dutch driver ahead of the 2 Ferraris at Red Bull's home track. However, Max's teammate Sergio Perez was dropped 9 places in qualifying, leaving him 13th for the sprint, as he was seen to have breached track limit rules in order to get into Q3. This lap was subsequently deleted, and his next best Q2 lap was only good enough for P13. This promoted George Russell to P4 on the sprint grid, despite both himself and his teammate Lewis Hamilton having crashed in Q3. The older British driver, 7-time world champion Lewis Hamilton, having crashed at turn 7 with 5 minutes to go in the final session, which resulted in only P10, and George Russell later on in the session, as he was finishing a flying lap. However, thanks to the Brit's first effort in Q3, he remained in P5, and as I said earlier, was promoted to 4th after Sergio Perez was reprimanded. This was not the only news which will have not amused Mercedes coming into the weekend, as Toto Wolff brought up the new flexi floor debacle on Friday, citing that competitors were exploiting the rules that floors on the 2022 F1 cars are only allowed to flex by 2mm in order to make gains in performance due to increased downforce. Now, the FIA have decided to clamp down on these loopholes by the French Grand Prix in 2 weeks' time, as they are contributing to the increase in porpoising, something that Mercedes have not struggled with so much in the past few races. But Max Verstappen accused Mercedes themselves of employing flexible floors, in fact concluding that their floors are the most flexible. It is clear that, like the pants and piercings debacle at the start of the season, as well as the discussion about the cost cap, that this tit-for-tat battle, this verbal warfare, for and against these flawed flaws, are only going to continue. Coming back to qualifying, and Haas and Alpine both saw success as well, with their fourth and fifth double Q3 finishes respectively this season. The final piece of news to note coming into the Austrian Grand Prix weekend was from the Alfa Romeo team, as Valtteri Bottas, who qualified 12th on Friday afternoon, would start at the back of the grid for Sunday, after taking almost an entirely new power unit. The two-time Austrian race winner would certainly have his work cut out for him if he wanted to make it 3. Now onto the sprint race, and it was Max Verstappen who would make it 2 from 2 in sprint race victories this season, taking all 8 points on offer on the Saturday. The Dutchman had a good start, leading away from lights out and building up a nearly 3-second gap, while the two Ferraris fought behind, Leclerc coming out on top in the end, thanks to a daring move at turn 4. George Russell would have a very lonely sprint race in 4th, with no one anywhere near him for the entire event. But he was feeling some pressure at the end of the sprint race from Sergio Perez, as the Mexican threw some phenomenal overtaking moves, such as a turn 3 dive bomb on Mick Schumacher, brought about due to a tussle between the two Haas cars, as well as a move for P5 on Esteban Ocon on lap 12. Lewis Hamilton would take the final points-paying position on Saturday, despite making contact with Pierre Gasly at the first corner, the Frenchman ending up in 5th. The Brit also made a move work on Mick Schumacher at turn 4 with 2 laps to go. Bottas would end up 10th, which of course would not matter, as the Finn would be demoted to the back of the grid, with the two McLarens following close behind. Lando Norris, who finished 11th, would be forced off the track by Alex Albon on lap 6, the Thai driver being handed a 5-second time penalty for this incident and ending up in 16th. Stroll and Zhou, who stalled before he could make the grid and was forced to start in the pit lane, followed, with Tsunoda in 17th. And Nicholas Latifi was the last of the finishers, ahead of 6 world championships. Sebastian Vettel would also tangle with Alex Albon, being spun out at turn 1, a sour reward for making up 6 places in the first 10 laps from his dire grid position of P20. Aston Martin would decide to retire the car in the closing stages, rather than risking more damage on the car for Sunday's race. Finally, Fernando Alonso did not even start the sprint, as he was left up on his jacks with his tyres in their blankets. It emerged later that Alonso had suffered a technical issue on the grid, so could not start the sprint, even from the pit lane, which meant that his 8th place in quali was for nothing. Now for my driver of the sprint, and it was most definitely Sergio Perez. The Mexican will have been very disappointed to have made the mistake which cost him his Q3 lap in qualifying, but he made up for it with a great recovery drive in the sprint, which saw some mesmerising overtaking manoeuvres, as well as 3 extra points to contribute to his title challenge, having finished in the top 5 of every sprint race since Italy last year. Now for my team of the sprint, and it had to be Red Bull. I've already talked about Sergio Perez, but Max Verstappen has been dominant all weekend, and he is also dominated in the sprint, checking out at the front thanks to the early squabbles between the two Ferraris, and never looking back. It was a great Saturday for Red Bull. Finally, for my struggle of the sprint, and it is Alex Albon. He started the day in a phenomenal 11th in the Williams, but he got entangled in a plethora of incidents throughout the sprint, taking the time penalty for the collision with Norris and spinning out Sebastian Vettel, ending up in 16th. This is a big disappointment after having looked so good in qualifying in 12th, and he now has a huge mountain to climb if he wants to take his 3rd points finish of the season. Now on to the race, and it was Charles Leclerc who would take his first podium since Miami, his first victory since Australia, his first victory in Austria, and his first victory when he had not qualified on pole. What a turnaround for the Monegasque. He finished ahead of title rival Max Verstappen, who started well from pole position, but struggled in the early stages of the Grand Prix, with Leclerc drawing up close on lap 10 and at turn 3 and again at turn 4, finally making the move work on lap 13 at turn 4 down the inside of the Dutchman. Max decided to ditch his mediums a lap later, having suffered hugely from degradation in the early stages, dropping to 8th place and being picked off by Mick Schumacher at turn 3 on lap 16. However, after the rest of the midfield ahead of him pitted, Max moved past Lewis Hamilton for the final podium position. Leclerc pitted for the first time on lap 27, falling behind Max, then regaining the lead on lap 33 on the car whose number was formerly 33. And it was the Red Bull driver who was one of the first to switch to the two-stop strategy on the 37th lap, going on to some brand new hards. Leclerc was the next to pit on lap 50, closing in on Max Verstappen by only lap 53, showing the pace of the Ferrari this weekend. And he made the move work on the exit of turn 3, doing the old switcheroo, as Crofty said, for the lead. But the complexion of the race was changed on lap 57 as Carlos Sainz, who looked on to take Max Verstappen for P2 and for his 7th podium of the season, retired with a massive engine failure, which resulted in a somewhat shocking fire at the back of Sainz's car, bringing out the virtual safety car, under which the two front runners both pitted. This is a massive disappointment for Carlos, who had been driving very competently all day and was not rewarded accordingly. It's a big letdown after his great victory at the British Grand Prix. The race resumed on lap 60, and despite facing throttle issues in the closing stages, which let Max draw within 2 seconds of the Ferrari driver, Leclerc went on to take the victory. It was not enough for Max, and Charles finally had a positive result in the bag, moving ahead of Sergio Perez in the Drivers' Championship and moving within 38 points of the leader Verstappen. But just behind the front two were the two Mercedes drivers once again. Lewis Hamilton taking his 3rd podium in 3 races, as well as now only having finished outside of the top 6 3 times this season. But it was not smooth sailing for the Brit, who encountered braking issues before the Grand Prix even began, but he managed to get through the first corners unscathed, unlike on Saturday, when he made contact with Gasly at turn 1. The same cannot be said, however, for his Mercedes teammate George Russell, who spun out Sergio Perez at turn 4, the Mexican being forced to retire on lap 26, his 2nd DNF in 3 races, as he had picked up substantial damage to his side pods, and George Russell was accordingly handed a 5-second time penalty, pitting on lap 12 to both serve his penalty and replace his broken front wing. Whilst Russell floundered at the back, Lewis made quick work of the two Haas drivers, passing Schumacher with a bold move at turn 8 of all places. Hamilton finally pitted on lap 29, having been in the podium positions for quite some time, but had a 4-second pit stop, falling behind midfield rival Esteban Ocon. But both Mercedes drivers would improve on lap 30, as Hamilton regained track position on Ocon at turn 3, as Russell moved on Ricciardo. Despite this race being cited as a one-stopper for most, George would be the next to defy this, pitting for the 2nd time on lap 42, and having picked up Schumacher, Stroll and Zhou, ending the Grand Prix with another pair of overtakes on the Alpine duo of Alonso and Ocon, on lap 55 and 62 respectively. This is now the 5th 3-4 finish for Mercedes, and means that they now have nearly 3 times as many points as